Before we begin talking about Palestine and about the challenges and strengths of our movement, the Palestinian movement, the Allied movement, Solidarity movement for a Free Palestine, we should always remember to recognize that we are sitting here on stolen land. This is a settler colony. We are on stolen land. We have to recognize the Ohlone nation as the only people who have claims to this land, and to always, always be critical of our own subjectivities of being here, right? So if we're talking about ending apartheid, ending occupation, ending colonization of Palestine, we got to start right here. Second thing is what I've seen in SJP over the last many years is a real undertaking of beginning to connect the Palestinian struggle to other struggles. And that's been one of the more important shifts that's been happening in SJP. We have to recognize that the struggles that we're facing here as students of color, as student populations in general, is coinciding with the larger attack on communities of color, on immigrant communities, on Native communities, on Black men, right? On women, on workers. And only by understanding the issues of justice in our local community, the things that are happening in our backyard, how we connect to it, is the only way that we're actually going to be able to make any tangible change in the work that we're doing around Palestine. Dina opened up her speech by talking about the people who couldn't be in this room today, or who are not couldn't, but are not in this room today. And I think that it's really important that she acknowledge that, because as a student population who is in this room today, we're coming with a lot of privilege, right? We might be under attack, and we might be sacrificing and giving up a lot. We're also privileged enough to be on university campuses. We're also privileged enough to make it all the way here. And we're also privileged enough to be at Stanford University. But there are members of our community who are under attack. There are members, elders in our community who have been fighting for years, who are becoming the symbols of criminalizing Arab and Muslim Palestinian communities. Just this week, how many of you are familiar with the case of Rasmiya Awad? All right, so we got a consciousness here. Just this week, Department of Homeland Security picked up one of the elders, a cultural icon for the Palestinian movement, Rasmiya Awad, who's been doing incredible work at the Arab American Action Network in Chicago, and is charging her with quote-unquote immigration fraud for failing to mention that 45 years ago she was a Palestinian prisoner in Israeli jails, or she was charged with that. And this is not an isolated incident. It's in large part connected to the genealogy of attacks on social movements. From COINTELPRO, the infiltration that has happened from the Black Power movement to Chicano movements to the Arab and Muslim communities, from the LA8 to the Holy Land Foundation to the Sami al-Aliyan case to the Midwest 23 case. We have to be able to center the community workers who are under attack by these criminalizing policies at the center of our analysis and the center of our work as student populations. Because if we can't continue to defend and talk about and make sure that the people who are in our community that we see as heroes are decriminalized, that we will never be able to actually continue doing the work that we're doing. And that's the first thing that we need to keep in mind when we're continuing to do this work around Palestine. We cannot just think about what's happening with our people and our occupation in the homeland, but we have to think about how do we sustain the movement here, and defense of our community members who are the most vulnerable is the most important thing that we really need to be taking up as young people with the leverage and political bargaining strengths that we have. So the talk today is about the history of student movements, the generations and decades-long movements of students, Palestinian students, that have come before us today that sort of set the pathway for us to be here in this room. Many of you guys know that before SJP, the dominant Palestinian student organizing sphere for many decades was called the General Union of Palestine Students. How many guppies do we have in the room? We have some guppies here, right? All right, right here in the front row. So San Francisco State is home to the last standing chapter of the General Union of Palestine Students. There were some attempts, and I actually haven't followed up, so I don't know if that's a false claim, but there were some attempts to rebuild GUPS in New Orleans and Chicago and New York in the last few years. I'm not sure if it's still around. Anyone know? Are they around? GUPS? No? Okay. So GUPS was the largest and most effective union of the Palestine Liberation Organization. And the Palestine Liberation Organization, for many years, as you all know, was the spearheading forerunners of the Palestinian Liberation Project. Now, I know we use these terms a lot, right? Like, so we still talk about the PLO, we still talk about the Palestinian Liberation Project, but there was severe shifts and ruptures in our Palestinian Liberation Project historically, which also Mezna is going to be talking about a little bit, that really deteriorated our student movements from being able to be the student movements that they were in the 70s, in the 80s, and up until the 90s. The reason why I say the 70s and the 80s is because before GUPS, there was a very, very broad movement of Arabs for Palestine, right? So although GUPS was founded officially in 1959 in Cairo, we had Organization of Arab Students here in the United States, and they were the main sort of national group that were taking on the Palestine question as their fundamental work. And we saw shifts with the Organization of Arab Students as the decline of Pan-Arabism as it was taking place in the US, in the Arab world. And so just starting with that point, I bring that up because it's so important to know that we here in the US are not as isolated as the Zionist and dominant discourse would make us to believe we are. We are a reflection of the political transformations and the shifts that are actually happening in the homeland. And so the kinds of challenges that you're facing as Palestinian students, as Arabs, as allies, as students on campuses, really reflects, is a mirroring, spitting image of the challenges that youth in the Arab world and all over the world are facing today. And so in the history of the Palestinian student movement, what was happening back home reflected here. A large part of this was because the Palestinian movement was characterized by its transnational dimension, right? The Palestinian struggle is a settler colonial struggle. 70% of the population lives outside of historic Palestine, in refugee camps and exiles worldwide. Well, that creates a sense of loss and a disenfranchisement because we're not on our homeland to be able to resist our occupation from within the boundaries, quote-unquote, so-called boundaries of our historic homeland. We also have the power to situate our struggle as part of the transnational struggle against injustice, imperialism, colonialism, the imposition of nation states, and displacement that is occurring also to most third world people across the world and has been happening. In 2006, I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about what happened. Mezna is going to be talking more about GUPS. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what happened with GUPS, what happened in the conversation with GUPS about in 2006. As many of you know, everyone knows that the Oslo Accords disabled the Palestinian unions, correct? Right? For the most part?
Yes.
Okay. So I don't have to do that? All right. So in 1993, after the Oslo Accords, we really felt a rupture in the Palestinian Liberation Project here in the United States. Our GUPS, which was the largest GUPS in the world, which was one of the most active GUPS in the world, practically collapsed. San Francisco State was able to maintain itself because it had a physical office, and because there's a history of San Francisco State, which I'll dive into a little bit later with the 1968 student strikes and the history of the College of Ethnic Studies. However, when we found ourselves outside of the original Palestinian unions that were the sectors spearheading the liberation movement of our struggle, and when we found ourselves in the so-called peace process in which the Palestinian movement and resistance was stifled inside Palestine and transnationally in the 90s, while Israeli settlement expansion increased at rapid rates faster than any other period in history, we then come to the Second Intifada. Drastically different uprising than the first. Different type of organization and a much more unclear role of the transnational role of Palestinians towards the struggle. In 2006, after the parliamentary elections that were imposed on the Palestinians by the US, in which Hamas won, and the civil sectarian fighting began between the dominant Palestinian parties, Fatah and Hamas, Palestinian youth said, enough. This is where the start of the story of the Palestinian youth movement comes from. Young Palestinians from the Arab world and from Palestine who had met each other in large part through NGOs and solidarity organizations, started talking with each other and said, what can we do to bring ourselves together as a new generation? Our own people are fighting each other. Our supposed leadership hasn't taken a real role as a leadership for a liberation project in decades. Our ability to resist our occupation, our ability to advocate for the refugee right of return, our ability to locate ourselves within our struggle is deteriorating. What can we do? And there were three main premises that brought these youth together in the founding conference of the Palestinian Youth Network, which was in 2006 in Barcelona. One, where is the transnational dimension of the Palestinian struggle? Why are we talking about slivers of pieces, of chunks of Gaza Strip and the West Bank? And really, even when we're talking about that, we're not talking about the Palestinian rights. We're only talking about allowing them to survive. When in large part, the rest of our population is still under a severe military occupation, hosted as second-class citizens in the state of Israel, and 70% of Palestinians who are refused entry and return to their homeland, who are living outside of it, the majority of which are living as refugees in refugee camps, still, 60 years later. So when we talked about the transnational dimension, we said, enough is enough. We are not a broken population anymore. The imposition of fragmentation to say, oh, Gaza Palestinians, oh, the West Bank Palestinians, oh, the Arab Israelis, oh, the refugees from this camp, or refugees from that camp, or the exiles, or oh no, they're Fatah, or oh no, they're Hamas, or oh no, they're this, or oh no, they're that. We wanted to refuse that, and we wanted to say we are a Palestinian population, a transnational population, and our struggle is about returning to our homeland and liberating our homeland. Not advocating for small bits and chunks of historic Palestine, and not advocating for basic human rights without actually having the ability to live in dignity. The second thing that brought us together was the concept of youth. What I mean by that is that those of us who were involved in politics as young people could not find a real role. We felt that we were being used as tokens. We felt that we were being used as laborers, making posters, sending out emails. We felt that we were exploited as a youth body, and we felt that we lacked the political training and development. We felt that we lacked the agency as a youth body, and we felt that people couldn't see us as a force to be reckoned with. And in order to cultivate that spirit, we had to come together as youth. The third thing, here is where we get into the SJP stuff, is solidarity. Why did we come together as a Palestinian youth network? The majority of us are actually very critical of nationalisms, right? We know that the history of nationalisms has had its pitfalls. It's bolstered some romantic notions of a singular identity, of sometimes oppressive forces of imposing identity and imposing political projects. But we came together as Palestinians because we felt that there was a very specific colonial condition as Palestinians that couldn't be navigated within our solidarity spaces. That was one. The second is that we felt that our role as Palestinians, as individuals, became diluted by being a part of a solidarity framework. This is specifically for those of us who are outside of the Arab homeland, not just those who are in the Arab countries, not just specific to those who are in the far diaspora, not necessarily those who are in the Arab countries. We felt that somehow being a part of the solidarity emergence, right, the business of solidarity organizations, which really took their place throughout the Second Intifada, in light of the ruptured Palestinian Liberation Project, in light of the inability of the Palestinian population on a transnational level to organize and spearhead their movement alongside allies, but through self-determined means, we felt that through that vacuum, solidarity forces emerged as a business. We felt that solidarity forces emerged as a place in which it took the place of the Palestinian role in the national struggle, or the Palestinian role in the liberation movement, and that we somehow, rhetorically, were in solidarity with our own selves, right? So I'm a Palestinian here in the United States. I have nowhere to work. I don't have an institution to join. I don't have anything that's connecting me to the Palestinian struggle, especially if I'm outside of a university campus. And somehow, I'm working with people who I share the same stakes of Palestine's liberation with, which would be great. However, what was happening inside some of these solidarity movements is that it became, in some ways, a war of words. So it really stopped at sort of spreading a discourse, spreading education, and somehow shifted into some kind of sympathy or pity for the Palestinian people, largely dominated by humanitarian things, by discourse on human rights, by discourse on specifically focusing on attacks on Gaza, or specifically focusing on settlements in the West Bank. And so the entirety and the complexity of the Palestinian experience, and the entirety and the complexity of the Palestinian aspirations for liberation was diluted through that. And that's what kind of brought us together as the Palestinian Youth Network at that time, which later became the Palestinian Youth Movement. In the afternoon, we're going to do a workshop in which I'm going to talk more about the PYM and sort of how the politics have changed and evolved, and is less so much focused on Palestinians as an identity and more focused on principles. So if you guys would like to attend that, that would be great. The reason I mention these things is because I want to take us back to the original foundations of what student movements were functioning around in the United States and transnationally when it came to Palestine. It was based on the concept of a people's movement against settler colonialism, right? So we weren't using the terminology of apartheid, not because we didn't think it was significant, or not because someone didn't think, oh, well, let's try to compare it to South Africa, but because apartheid was only one element of what was happening in Palestine, right? The same way it was only one element of what was happening in South Africa, but it somehow became the dominant discourse characterized in South Africa, and uprooting what was happening in South Africa from its real origins, which was settler colonialism. The second thing of why I mentioned this story is because I wanted to tell the story of how we need to overcome our fragmentation. So when people think of fragmentation right now, we specifically think of fragmentation between groups, right? So civil fighting between different Palestinians inside and outside, fighting between communities of color here on the local level, fragmentation of like communities, a lack of unity, right? There is no such thing as unity, right? The concept of unity is oppressive in and of itself. But learning to build collective processes to work and strive and aspire together is the solution to this so-called fragmentation, right? So we want to be able to build a kind of collective processes that overcome our fragmentation. And the way to be able to do that as student populations is to zoom out of what we've been looking at. So when we think of Palestine, when we think of the work that we're doing around boycott, divestment, and sanctions, it's very focused on specific elements of the Palestinian struggle, or very focused on specific strategies, or very focused on specific narratives of Palestinians, right? And the way to be able to actually go back to basics and situate the Palestinian struggle and a real justice-centered solution, we could say, to the Palestinian struggle is to sort of zoom out and think about framing the work that we're doing and the strategies that we're deploying as student populations through a justice-centered model in which the least amount of contradictions takes place. And so that we're not, basing certain Palestinian rights or certain elements of our struggle at the exclusion or at the expense of other Palestinian rights, or just ignoring it altogether. That's really important for us to do because, you know, why are we doing this if we're not here to really be justice-centered? The second thing that I wanted to say, how many of you are Palestinian? Okay, wow, so we have a big group of Palestinians in here, right? So for a really long time, I have to say this, and again, this is like my opinion, so I'm not like the spokesperson for all Palestinians. For those of you who are not Palestinian, there's probably lots of other articulations of this. The concept of self-determination kind of got hijacked out of our hands. I don't even know if that's the right word to be using, but it really kind of got taken out of our hands, right? Because while there was the emergence of solidarity movements, the Palestinian claim of trying to come back together as a Palestinian body was our narratives, our articulations, our self-determination. What about our voices? What about our needs? You need to listen to us. You, the ally with Palestine, you need to listen to me as a Palestinian. While it's important to be censuring those who are bearing the most material consequences of life under occupation or as displaced or refugees, displaced peoples or refugees, having a Palestinian representative in your group and listening to them is not the solution. There are a lot of Palestinians, especially now, especially as a production of the post-Oslo climate, that don't speak on behalf of the interests of the National Liberation Project. There are a lot of Palestinians who are, you know, who would like to speak on behalf of the National Liberation Project, but who are just really struggling to be able to do that because the repercussions and the consequences would be very severe, right? So while it's important to center Palestinian narratives at the center of your analysis, we're not talking about one group of Palestinians or one narrative or listening to one Palestinian because they're a Palestinian. We're talking about centering an absolute, universal, justice-centered approach to Palestine and Palestinians at the center of our analysis. That's what we're talking about. And so it gets tricky when we talk about self-determination because there might be some Palestinians who say, you have to listen to me because I'm a Palestinian. But we have to be kind of critical about those concepts as well, right? The second thing I wanted to talk about was why that's different, why the concept of self-determination is different than what it was in the GUPS days. GUPS was primarily a place of Palestinian students. There were Arab students, there were allies who worked with GUPS. In the 80s, GUPS formed the Palestine Solidarity Committee, which was really sort of a broad-based coalition of mostly third world community organizations and different struggles that were coming together to look at how Palestine was part and parcel of the larger struggle against colonialism and injustice across the world. But that coalition didn't take away from the fact that there was a Palestinian space within GUPS. And that GUPS was connected to the transnational Palestinian body and the transnational Palestinian body politic. As SJP, Students for Justice in Palestine, we're a mixed group of Palestinians and non-Palestinians. I'm not actually an SJP, so I'm not going to claim you guys. I'd like to be, but, you know. It's a mixed group of Palestinians and non-Palestinians who are maintaining a very singular and dialectical relationship, specifically with the West Bank, specifically with one element of Palestine. The answer to this is not new. This is the kind of criticism that I'm providing here. But the answer is not coming from me. And the answer is also not returning to some cultural, romantic past of what once was, thinking that if we undo the last 25 years, that will be the perfect movement, being able to produce the perfect revolution, right? But the answer was done years ago, and it was to work locally. It was to connect locally. It was to connect to struggles and communities locally, right? That's how I opened up this talk. If we can't understand the mass incarceration of young people of color in this country, there is no way that we can understand political prisoners in Palestine. Now, when I talk about acting locally, you guys are probably thinking, we're freaking exhausted. Like, we're already in our community organizations doing the little we can. We're trying to go to school, we're trying to pay for school, we're trying to do student activism, we're trying to do boycott, divestment, sanctions bills. How the hell are we going to act more locally than what we're doing? Well, for starters, the university our approach as organizers on the university needs to change. It's not about creating a consciousness, and it's not about spreading awareness about Palestine, and it's not about spreading the message about what's happening in Palestine. It's about taking back our universities. Over the last 40 years, we have seen a war waged on us through our universities. When I mean us, I mean people of color, working people, I mean immigrant populations, I mean indigenous populations. And when I say that this war has been waged through the universities, what I mean by this is us returning to 1968. 1968, the largest and longest student strike in the history of the US, which waged student strikes across this country and across the world, started at San Francisco State University, was with the Third World Liberation Front, and they were calling for a relevant education. They were calling for demands that would allow for the articulation of people of color's narratives and stories and oppression and history of resistance as part of the university space. And those students were on strike for 6 months. And that strike, this year is the 45th anniversary of that strike, by the way. That strike is what created the first and only College of Ethnic Studies at San Francisco State University. It created departments of ethnic studies across the US, and it created more focus on student of color organizing on university campuses. But that moment was very short-lived. The 70s, where there's a rapid demographic shift on our university campuses in the US, I'm specifically speaking about public universities. Rapid demographic shift on our campuses, public universities in the 1970s, in which the social majority became the children of blue-collar laborers. It became people of color. We were the majority in the 1970s. We were the majority in the 1970s who became the student population that was challenging the university, who was originally producing labor for an industrial society and now shifting into the post-industrial society. And starting in the 1980s, that all changed. The war on our communities through the university started with the university becoming pigeonholed as a profitable location. It no longer became the place for social convergence. It no longer became the place for freedom of thought to be produced and shared. It no longer became the place in which struggles and movements and thinking were intersecting to create new possibilities of social justice. It no longer became that because it was taken from us in the 1980s. And there have been wars, decade after decade, that has continued making university inaccessible for people of color, inaccessible for low-income communities, and basically becoming a reserved space for elite communities and a place where we can shape young people to become workers on a profitable level. So this is where we see the shift of the university happening from a place where students were going to get an education, a real education, in which self-education and growth was happening, and a place where, post-1980s, human capital and development became the major goals of the university. The university became a place in which it wasn't considered doing anything unless it could produce something profitable, unless it could produce something measurable, unless it could train human capital for businesses across the US to bolster the capitalist structures that we have going on here. And there's no more of an example of that than the subsidized budgets that have been signed onto between private companies and the university to advance their sciences, on university campuses while killing public funding to the university. By killing public funding to the university, that's a direct attack on the humanities. That's a direct attack on ethnic studies, on women's studies, on all the fields in which actual thinking and production to be able to create the kind of social change that we need in our society is no longer happening on our campuses. Then we see a wave of culture wars that are being produced by conservative, right-wing conservatives to attack student organizations on campuses in the 1990s, to isolate and attack professors, to limit their freedom of speech, to limit their ability to teach their classroom and develop their own pedagogy in their classroom, to standardize curriculum on an institutional higher learning university campus, to institutionalize curriculum by what the state mandates we need to be doing, right? When this happens in the early 90s, it's increased by the attack on immigrant students in university campuses, by attack on affirmative action on campuses, and by the signing on of many public universities with corporations specifically who are producing research for weapons production, especially in the UC system. So we don't have control of our campuses anymore. Our student unions have been slipping through our hands. Our humanities departments are under massive attack in terms of funding and in terms of academic freedom. And in addition, after 9/11, we see a whole new sort of wave of attacks through the likes of David Horowitz and Islamofascism weeks all over our campuses, right? And they're claiming that they're being censored by academic freedom. There's a problem here, right? So if David Horowitz is able to say that he is being censored and that right-wing voices are being threatened by so-called liberal professors and student organizations and the liberalization of university campuses, and they're winning in some places, and the fights that they're getting are from student organizations and not from administrations, right? Then where are we now? Why am I talking about the public university campus as it pertains to SJP in Palestine? Because, as I mentioned before, Palestinians are in a place of deteriorating conditions, right? When we think of Palestine, we think of the last 25 years, we think about the rupture of the unions, we're thinking about the annexation of more and more lands, Israel kind of imposing all of these new limitations, pigeonholing the Palestinian leadership into negotiations that lasted for however many years, and it's not really negotiations, it's kind of just stalling for time to take more lands, and stifling all forms of Palestinian resistance. In addition, we're seeing complete erasure of the Palestinian population in the refugee camps. How many of you are familiar with Yarmouk refugee camp? Okay. Yarmouk refugee camp is the largest Palestinian refugee camp in Syria. It's been under siege, it's under attack. Aside from it being the largest population, it's also been the political headquarters for the Palestinian diaspora. It's been the place, sort of the symbolic place in which the refugee population, in which the refugee return to Palestine has been sort of symbolically crystallized in that camp. That camp is under attack. And we keep talking about pressuring Israel, embarrassing Israel, instead of talking about attacking Zionism. The way that we can attack Zionism, as individuals, we can go home at the end of the night and write an op-ed and attack Zionism or pressure Israel by embarrassing it, right? But the way that we attack Zionism is local. We have to attack Zionism by starting on the local level and thinking about the university space not as a temporary place where we are coming for 4 years and leaving, but we are taking it back and we are preparing it for generations that are coming after us, for the university to be a public university, open to community, open to social movement. That's what we need to be doing right now. By doing that, we can ensure that our work does not go unrecognized, does not go erased in history by the Zionist forces that are trying to erase all evidence that there are voices of dissent and that there are actions of dissent. This is what we must be doing right now. Taking back our university spaces, preparing it for next generations to make sure that the majority of the people in this country's interests, people of color, immigrant population, is met at the university space, and ensuring that the university space is a host site for that kind of social transformation we need. Now, the closing plenary in this conference is on joint struggle. And I have to say, when I saw the program for this conference, this Students for Justice in Palestine conference, I was actually really excited because I felt that there was a shift happening in our student organizing in which recognizing Palestine not as an isolated case and not as the most oppressive people, right? Not recognizing it in that way, but connecting it to the struggles that we live every day, connecting it to the systems that are oppressing people and oppressing us here in this country, in our very own locales. By doing that, we have the possibility as a student population to produce more change, more effective change, more sustainable change. And that concept of joint struggle should not only be seen as a principle or as symbolic or as, you know, limiting the contradictions in our political claims that we want to see a free Palestine, but it also should be embedded into our practice. It should be embedded into our strategy. When we create big political frameworks and big political language that says an end to this and we're for this and human rights and this and that, but we're failing to actually embed that into our strategies, we're not doing anything. We will be erased. It's a statement that will go away. It's a framework that will go away. And that discourse will not produce the kind of change that we need to see. SJP has done some incredible work around boycott, divestment, and sanctions. But from the history of student movements, as I think maybe Dina or Mezna had said, it was always a part of the work of Palestinians before SJP. It will always be a part of the work of communities of color who are fighting any kind of repressive regime. But the politics and framework around it have to change, and our strategies have to change inside of it. When we're going in for a boycott, divestment, and sanctions bill, we should not be focusing on companies that are just doing something in the settlements in the West Bank. Because when we do that, we isolate Palestine and we isolate something inside of Palestine. We prioritize certain Palestinians over other Palestinians, and we're prioritizing Palestinians over all the other people who are struggling for justice. We need to choose the companies. We need to choose the companies that have a local impact. We need to choose the companies that are building walls in Palestine and building walls on the borders of Mexico. We need to choose the companies that are building prisons in Palestine and building prisons here that are participating in the mass incarceration of black men in this country. We need to be choosing companies, and we need to be making those connections. And that's how we're going to be building the popular bases, and that's how we're going to be practicing the politics, limiting the contradictions, and that's how we're going to be holding ourselves accountable. We are not in this to be a business. We are not in this to be saviors of Palestinians or righteous intellectuals talking about Palestine or saying something that other Palestinians, a 5-year-old Palestinian, couldn't tell you in a refugee camp. They can tell us that better than any of us here can. What we're here to do is create the platform with the power that we have as being in the United States and the power that we have of being on university campuses, and to create that platform to continue making sure that the role of students and youth is no more marginalized. We have to take back the role of students and youth, if not for Palestine, then for our futures here in the US. And I'm going to stop there. We'll be back on Q&A, so if there's anything I said in my rant that was unclear, you can check me on that then. Thank you.